Hi friends, so you're probably aware that the US has had crippling sanctions on Iran and Venezuela now for some time, and it's causing a terrible situation for Iranians. And Scott Ritter writes, the US hopes both sanctions and Covid-19 in Iran will force regime change, but it's a mass murder that will only strengthen the Tehran government. And Scott Ritter is a former US Marine Corps intelligence officer. He served in the Soviet Union as an inspector implementing the INF Treaty, and there's a list of different things that he was a weapons inspector as well. So Scott goes on to say, Iran's New Year celebration of Nowruz, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, finds it's weathering a perfect storm of US sanctions, low oil prices, and Covid-19. The resulting humanitarian crisis may make it even more resilient as Iranians rally around their government. Iran is facing an existential crisis brought on by a combination of economic, political, and social emergencies which, when combined, threaten to bring the nation to its knees. The United States has over the years sought to destabilize Iran in hopes that it would collapse from within, clearing the way for a new pro-Western government. And that's the second time I know of where they're trying to overthrow Iran. The current, quote, maximum pressure, end quote, campaign built around stringent economic sanctions targeting every aspect of the Iranian economy is designed to not only bring Iran to the negotiating table, but to drive its leadership from power. The chances of such an outcome today, however, are slim. The Iranian government has proven itself to be quite resilient, and the very policies that the US is pursuing in Iran may turn out to be counterproductive, rallying Iranians around their embattled government. This is not to say that the domestic political situation inside Iran is ideal for the government, far from it. The economic crisis in Iran brought on by US sanctions has led to a loss of confidence in the moderate government of President Hassan Rouhani, leading to the election of a conservative parliamentary majority on February 21st. The percentage of Iranians who actively participated in this election was around 42%, a nearly 20% point decline from the previous legislative election in 2016. The low electoral turnout was a clear-cut vote of no confidence on the part of the Iranian people in their system of government. In addition to crippling US sanctions, an oil price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which began on March 9th, has gutted Iran's already fragile economy, further testing the frayed relationship between the Iranian people and their government. And if this wasn't enough, Iran's first case of coronavirus was detected on February 19th. By March 20th, about 20,000 Iranians were stricken with the disease, more than 1,400 of whom had died. The Iranian healthcare system was being overwhelmed with patients, with no end in sight. There was no hint of regime change tinged animosity in Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's Nowruz address to the people in Iran, in which he declared that, quote, we are saddened to learn of the mounting deaths the virus has caused, particularly in Iran, end quote. Pompeo closed by noting that, quote, to support the recovery from this especially difficult time, our offer still stands to send humanitarian and medical assistance to the people of Iran. It's a little bit like, somebody having a noose around your neck and having it very tight till you're sort of turning a shade of blue, and meanwhile holding out to here I have some water. It might have a little bit of poison in it, but would you like some? That's how nuts that is, and it must be awful for Iranians to read such sinister, awful. It's beyond disgusting. There's no word to describe how to do this to a country that you've been trying to meddle in for decades, because they overthrew the Shah, who was installed by the US. The US did a coup in Iran, and they eventually overthrew the installed dictator that the US had put in there, and they've never forgiven Iran for that. And Iran won't submit to the US, and it's been decades now, and now here we are where they're constantly meddling. They've been constantly meddling all these decades, and now they're putting such stringent, horrific sanctions on Iran. I think there's like 800 or something, and they won't allow certain medicines to get in. And on top of that, they're in the middle of this awful pandemic that is sort of rivaling Italy. And there could be like a few, 2 or 3 million die because of this in Iran. This is what they're doing, the US. They have complete control over removing the sanctions and allowing medicines in and trying to allow the Iranian people to survive this pandemic. But no, that's not what the US does. The US wants to destroy countries that do not submit. They're not even that interested in having them. They just want to end any competition. They want complete, full-spectrum dominance. So anyway, earlier this week, Brian Hook, the US Special Representative for Iranian Affairs, in a statement to reporters, provided a more accurate picture of Washington's policy toward Iran. Our policy of maximum pressure on the regime continues, Hook noted. US sanctions are not preventing aid from getting to Iran, end quote. See, it's just a lie. These people lie like rugs. Pompeo just constantly lies. I mean, I don't know how one can do a job like that. You have to be a complete psychopath to be doing this to people and be willing to watch millions of people die like this. But then I think about what Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State during the early 90s, in the US Secretary of State, who, when asked, was 500,000 children, Iraqi children, dying of US sanctions, was it worth it? And she said, yes, I think it was worth it. What kind of people are these people? Responding to calls from China, Russia, and elsewhere for the US to provide some sanctions respite for humanitarian relief from the devastating impact of the corona pandemic in Iran, Hook observed the US had sent a diplomatic note to the Iranians offering assistance with coronavirus. This note, quote, was quickly rejected, end quote. But then Hook went on to blame Iran's leadership for the coronavirus outbreak, saying that Tehran, quote, spends billions on terrorism and foreign wars, end quote. See, this is an example of how, there's this, I can't remember who stated this, I don't think it was Goebbels, but there's this quote where if you blame the other side for all the things that you're doing, and that's what the US does all the time. Adding that if it had spent 1/10 of this money, quote, on a better healthcare system, the Iranian people would have been much better off, end quote. I mean, the hypocrisy is just staggering. Here's a country, the US, Trump actually has been sort of delaying action on the pandemic response because he wants to line up all, to make sure he gets his cut and make sure all his corporate buddies get their cut. If he doesn't instate Medicare for all for everybody in the US, then all the poor people and all the, and particularly the people who are undocumented, all the poor people, all the asylum seekers, and everyone else who can't afford to pay for the expensive cost of that sort of, to be treated basically when you test positive for COVID-19. If they can't afford it, they're not going to go and do it, are they? So unless Medicare for all is brought in, then this pandemic, it's going to be it's already going to be crazy amounts of people because Trump has been dragging his feet in the response to that pandemic. So, I invite you to check out Michael Moore. I'm not a fan of Michael Moore, but he's done a podcast. He has a podcast, and he's done a few podcasts now. They're called emergency podcasts, and he talks about what's happening in New York, and it's pretty. Sorry, that I've got to keep an eye on him. It's pretty shocking, actually. It's pretty shocking what's happening in New York City, because it's such a densely packed city. I think there's 8 million people there, and it's expected that maybe 2 million of those people will contract this virus, or could possibly, I don't know the statistics, but it seems like, it's just, there's a couple of hundred doctors and nurses who are sick with it. They don't have enough ventilators. They don't have enough hospital staff to deal with it. It's already becoming it's heading towards that Italy level situation. And the Italy level situation, I did a podcast episode on this. Basically, they're practicing catastrophic medicine, which means that they have to basically say people over a certain age don't get treated, people with comorbidities don't get treated. They only sort of treat people that they think can get through it, and even people who are not suffering with COVID-19 may not get into an ICU, and they don't have enough beds. And yesterday, 800 Italians died of this virus. Just in one day, 800. They have so many, they don't have enough room in the morgues, so the army is taking them to be cremated. I mean, it's awful what's going on in Italy. And that's one of the reasons, is because they didn't shut everything down. They didn't get people to stay at home. That's one of the reasons, and it takes nothing for this virus to escalate. It doubles, every few days. So if you have, say, 100, like New Zealand was saying just recently, they're shutting everything down because, they said we only have 100 cases, but that Italy once only had 100 cases, and 100 then 3 days later turns into 200, and then 3 days later turns into 400, and then 3 days later turns into 800, and then 3 days later turns into 1,600, and it goes like that. It just keeps doubling. And before you know it, you have this incredibly sharp spike. When you start getting up to those numbers where it's, 3,200, and then that doubles, and then it's 6,400, that kind of thing, you can see how quickly it goes. And when Pompeo says things like, they could have had a better healthcare system, and the Iranian people would be much better off. I mean, they don't have Medicare for all in the United States, even though they could easily. The sovereign economy can't afford to. In fact, the Yale study said that if the U.S. brought in Medicare for all, the country would save $450 billion with a B, and it would save, on top of the Obamacare thing, it would save an extra 70,000 lives a year. And in the case of this pandemic, who knows how many lives it would save? Millions. Because I think there's going to be millions die in the United States. And that's why if you want to find out more about that, just listen to Michael Moore's podcast on YouTube. It's called Rumble, R-U-M-B-L-E. And he talks about what's happening in New York, because there's a lot of people are whistleblowing to him, doctors and other people. And one of the people who was a whistleblower, who is anonymous, he knows who that is, obviously, but they don't want to be known, said that they actually heard Trump say when Tom Hanks was hospitalized with his wife and he came out and he was okay, he said, see, he'll be like the poster boy, and it'll show people that really there's nothing to worry about, that it's okay, meaning that it's sort of, well, first they thought it was a hoax, but that it's some sort of, that it's really about people just being paranoid, that it's not really something to be frightened of, that it's not actually going to turn out bad. That's what he was telling people, and this person was actually overheard him say that, basically. I can't remember the exact words, but anyway, if you listen to his Michael Moore's podcast, the emergency podcast he's done in the last few days, today is March 23rd here in Australia. So, if you check out the last few days, you'll see. And he's also done an interview with Dr. Stephanie Kelton, who's the economic advisor for Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020. And Stephanie Kelton is a proponent of MMT, and you heard me talk about that if you follow my channel. MMT is simply a description of the operational reality of a sovereign economy. So he's talking to her about this question, how are you going to pay for it? And I've just mentioned this Yale study that says that Medicare for all actually saves money. But they don't want to do this because they're beholden, all these Democrats and Republicans are beholden to the health insurance industry and Big Pharma. Big Pharma does incredible lobbying of Congress, huge amounts of money. Huge amounts. I think they're like one of the top lobbyists, more than even the weapons industry. So they all want their cut, and they don't want Medicare. They don't want anybody to bring in Medicare for all. And the politicians get their cut, and they don't want anybody to bring in Medicare for all. That's why they've been going out of their way, the Democratic Party, to sabotage Bernie Sanders. The last thing they want is for Bernie Sanders, who would bring in Medicare for all if he could, if they actually cooperate. And by the way, Joe Biden said he would veto Medicare for all if it got through the House and the Senate. He would veto it. This is the guy that the Democratic Party is pushing and trying to sabotage Sanders over. Unbelievable. To say, as bleak as the situation looks for the people of Iran, there is reason to believe that the Islamic Republic may emerge from this crisis stronger than when it entered. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif hinted at this in a tweet sent out in the aftermath of Brian Hook's press briefing. Quote, "The US administration gleefully takes pride in killing Iranian citizens on Nowruz," end quote, Zarif wrote, adding that the White House had taken its maximum pressure campaign to quote, "a new level of inhumanity with its utter contempt for human life," end quote. Zarif concluded by noting that, quote, "your policy will live in infamy, Iran won't break," end quote. So anyway, I'll leave a link to that and you can read the rest of that. Actually, there's only really a paragraph left. This is what the US does, and this is something that most people don't realize what's happening right now. And they put tremendous economic sanctions on Venezuela, which are crippling. And from 2017 onwards, there's been 40,000 plus Venezuelans have died due to these economic sanctions. People that couldn't get insulin, all that kind of thing. So this, and then at the same time, they're always going, the Venezuelan people, get rid of your dictator and all of this sort of thing, meaning Nicolas Maduro, who was, and then they install a dictator. You see, it's all sort of the opposite of what they say they're doing. They're always going on about helping the people and humanitarian assistance, but all that means is we want to overthrow your country, overthrow your government, and then we're going to bring in neoliberalism and we're going to pillage your resources and you're going to be as poor as dirt. That's what happens when the US interferes in countries. They end up either as poor as dirt or completely under the boot, like my country here. We just do. Nobody ever criticizes the US government. They just pretend like whatever they're doing isn't happening, and they go along with it often. They do go along with it. I mean, even the Labour Party has endorsed Juan Guaido, even though he's a self-appointed person who is openly attacked in the streets. Juan Guaido has invited the US to invade his own country. I mean, he's a traitor to his own country, and this is who the Labour Party here, Australian Labour Party, endorses. And the Greens Party, they'd never ever question US imperialism. They're all afraid to do it because they care about their careers more than actually speaking the truth and challenging US imperialism. They don't call out for the release of Julian Assange, even though Julian Assange is still in Belmarsh prison, and there'll be a coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak there, and they're stuck there. That could kill him because he's already not in a good way, because he's spent so much time, many years in the Ecuadorian embassy, and now in this Belmarsh prison, which amounted to torture, as the UN rapporteur on torture said, Niels Melzer. And now this coronavirus could kill him, and they'd be happy about that, really. They want him to die. They've been trying to kill him for years now, and they're doing it this way. So this is, this maximum pressure campaign on Iran is an absolute. As Alfred Zayed said, who was I can't remember his title, a special position in the UN. He said that this amounts to genocide, what they're doing to Iran. And I would totally agree. It amounts to genocide. It's an absolute disgrace. So please support the people of Iran. They need our support. And I don't know, appealing to governments at this point just seems pointless, really. Although not so much when you have smaller governments like here in Tasmania. I had something very good happen. I wrote to, I've had some dealings with some of the politicians in the Labor Party, in the Tasmanian Labor Party. And they're quite, in here on the state government level, they're some of them are fairly progressive. And when they weren't going to close the borders, when the Scott Morrison government, the coalition, was dragging its feet about closing borders, etc., I wrote to one of the politicians here in local government, in the state government, David O'Byrne, and I said, if we don't, I showed him this article from The Atlantic, which is about the Italy-level disaster that's happening, what's happening in Italy with the catastrophic medicine, as I explained earlier, doing triage, like wartime triage. This person will die, that person will live, that kind of thing. That's where they're up to. And how, the amount of people dying, and how that the doctors here are warning it could turn into an Italy-level disaster in Australia. So anyway, I showed him this article in The Atlantic, which is a good article. I'm not endorsing The Atlantic at all. It's a neocon rag. But this was a good one. And so he wrote back and he said, thanks for sending that. And he said that helped us it helped us advocate to the government to close the borders. They basically, I don't know if he just meant Tasmanian government or the federal, but whatever, I don't care as long as it happened, because otherwise I think we could have had, Tasmania only has about 500,000 people here, 500,000. Australia has about 25 million, but we could have, even at this stage with the late closure of these borders, we could end up having a lot of people. It may not be as bad as Italy, but could be almost as bad as that. It really depends how it goes in the next week or so. Because as I say, the numbers just keep going and going. They double and they double and they double, and it keeps going. And that's why the flattening the curve, staying at home, all the, the sanitizing, washing your hands, not touching your face, staying at home as much as possible and only going out when you absolutely have to, keeping away from people, etc. All of that is absolutely imperative for flattening the curve so that the hospital systems can cope with the amount of people that are going to be infected by this, because it's very infectious. And they won't have enough ICU beds. I've talked about this before in another video. A doctor was saying, an intensive care specialist was saying, even people that don't have the virus won't be able to get an ICU bed. For example, I'll mention New York City. In the whole of, I think, is it New York State? I think they have, or is it the whole of the US? Maybe it's, in the whole of New York State, basically, then they would need so many more ICU beds with staff to actually be there. I mean, that's the thing too. You have to have staff. It's not enough to say, here's a bed. You have to have staff. That it's a specialized thing. I used to work in intensive care a while ago now, but I used to work in intensive care and intensive care neuro as well. And, you have to have a one-to-one, obviously, nurse. And sometimes if they're not as sick, you can have 2 patients to 1 nurse. But it's, you need specialized teaching. You need specialized staff there. And it's not something you can just impart to somebody, sort of like if they set up these military hospitals. After you intubate a patient in a military hospital, it's not going to suddenly, they're going to suddenly know what to do, and it requires some experience. So, what's happening in New York, they're just not going, there's 7-8 million people there, they're just not going to have enough staff or ventilators to be able to deal with what's happening. Even if they have even if they use the private hotels, which they say they're doing, hotels, they're going to take over 10,000 hotels or something. They're just not going to have enough people. So it may end up an Italy-level situation in New York City. And the, what is it? Is it the Home Guard? I can't remember what they call it. The Home Guards or whatever that Tulsi Gabbard, I think, belongs to. They're actually moving into New York City quietly, and that could end up, they're probably going to end up cordoning off hospitals, and anybody who gets desperate and thinks they're not going to be able to get seen, who knows, that they might start shooting people. That's not hyperbole. If people, how people we all want our loved ones to come through it. We want people to be seen and to be able to get hospitalized if they need to. Well, there'll be people that won't be able to get that, and they will do it, then they'll start getting hysterical and riotous, and it could end up people being shot, that if they try to go past the barricade to get to the hospital. And P.S., all the celebrities will all have their doctors come to their house, and possibly even have a private nurse with a ventilator and everything at home. I mean, they have it all sorted. All these rich people have it all sorted. They won't even need to go to a hospital. They'll have people come to them. That's how it's going to be. But the rest of us, we plebs, who are irrelevant, won't have that. And that's where what do they call it? I forget what Americans call that. Somebody will tell me, but it's like a home guard thing, where the reserves or something. They're like military, but they're the reserves. Well, they'll come in and sort people out if they get riotous. So that's where we are. I mean, it's hard to imagine in literally 2 months it's gotten like this. And of course, the US, with the sort of government they have, and any government could do this, but the US could turn this into an authoritarian situation where after it eventually goes, which might take 2 years, but they start to bring in all these authoritarian measures like martial law and all this sort of thing, and making all these different laws, and then when it's all over they don't lift those laws, and so they've turned the country into an authoritarian country ruled by authoritarian basically, and Trump would love that. Trump would probably even postpone the election and sort of make out like we can't do it, which it probably is true, but he'll use that to his advantage. And so the last thing I wanted to say was that Intel had told Trump in January that this was coming, and China had already told the WHO what was happening, and it took him till I think it was March to do something. And every day counts. Like I said, this doubles every few days, every 3 days. So he actually had the intel. Now, in a fair world, in a just world, somebody like that, who's basically dragging their feet because they wanted to make sure all the private corporations got their cut before he actually acted, right? Something like that is like treasonous, really. It's sort of murderous, because there'll be possibly 2 or 3 million or more people are going to die because of him dragging his feet and not bringing in these measures. And then on top of that, ignoring Medicare for all. Like Bernie Sanders is much more of a leader. He's got his problems, but he's been I've seen him on Twitter talking about what needs to be done. That's a leader. And he would have installed Medicare for all just like that. And poor people, would have been able to go and have treatment at a hospital if they tested positive. And he would have organized the resources much better than this. The General Motors has said they're going to make ventilators, and there's another company that said they're going to make ventilators, but you need staff to work those ventilators. And I'm sure Bernie Sanders, if he would have done all he could to get enough people, enough medical staff, whether it even meant in bringing Cuba in, because Cuba's gone to Italy. Cuba has sent a bunch of doctors. They do this all the time. Cuba is incredible. They've sent a bunch of doctors to Italy. The Chinese are doing that too. See, they understand solidarity. They understand that we're an international community, and yet they're constantly vilified. Why? Because they are like that. Because they don't believe in this rapacious capitalist system, this end-stage capitalism that was bringing us to the end of our species' time on this planet, basically. It's an ecocide that's happening, and this is part of it too. This way they're dealing with this pandemic. Capitalism has to end. It really does. There's no happy face on capitalism. This is how it will always end up like this. The greedy will always make sure they have theirs, and the rest of us, we don't belong to that club, as George Carlin said. So, Cuba is going around and helping Italy, and they do this all the time. They go around the world. Their doctors are highly trained, and they go around the world helping like this. That's a fantastic country to do that. But the U.S. is so busy the U.S. government's so busy trying to make money for themselves. The politicians there, these awful psychopathic politicians, trying to make money for themselves, while the people in the country that they so-called say they care about are dying. They're more interested in keeping the big pharma and the insurance industry happy. Health insurance industry and the private hospitals that are making money, charging huge amounts of money. It's all about keeping their corporations happy. It's an inverted totalitarian state where they pay fealty to democracy and all of that kind of thing, but really it's all just run by corporations. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So please have good thoughts for Iran. Do whatever you can to bring this information to the people. By the way, Abby Martin and Mike Preisner, they did a live stream today, the Empire Files. I'll leave a link to that. It's a really good one about COVID-19 and about the political situation and about Iran and China, etc. So do check that out, Empire Files. You can find that on YouTube. I'll leave a link to it. So check that out. And so thanks very much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vigo. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Click the notifications bell, otherwise you won't receive notifications when I drop a video. Click the like button if you like the content. Thanks so much for watching. Stay safe, stay at home, wash your hands, do all the things that will do things that will benefit others, but from a distance. let's try and make this time beneficial to ourselves and try and realize that this really, really demonstrates how interconnected everything is. Capitalism is only one virus away from collapse. And remember that sovereign countries can afford Medicare for all. The governments just choose not to. They choose not to spend that money, even though they absolutely could. And this is all bare for us to see. We can see it right there in front of us now. It's all laid bare that they can bring up money just like this. And that's why you should check out Michael Moore's Rumble, where he does an interview with Dr. Stephanie Kelton, Bernie Sanders' economic advisor, because she explains all of that. We mustn't be in the dark about how the sovereign economy works, and that's why learning modern monetary theory is so important. It's not a theory, it's simply a description of the operational reality of a sovereign economy. So thanks so much for watching. Let's do self-care, be kind to ourselves, be healthy, adopt a plant-based diet. It's really good for you, but better still, it's good for other animals. They don't have to suffer and die needlessly. And so thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.